Once again, let me just welcome you to our Reframe and Refresh, which is a monthly series that is hosted by New Day Films. My name is Larissa Lam. I'm the director of a film called Far East Deep South about the early Chinese in Mississippi during segregation. And I'm also a member owner of New Day Films. And I'm very, very excited to welcome you here today, as well as our panelists. Before we get started with our official conversation, I want to bring on our very own Chitra Jairam and to talk a little bit more about New Day Films. Chitra?
Hey everyone, my name is Chitra. I am also a member owner and the marketing co-chair at New Day Films. New Day Films is a unique filmmaker-run distribution cooperative, providing award-winning films to educators, community groups, government agencies, public libraries, and businesses since 1971. Democratically run by more than 150 filmmakers, New Day is committed to reflecting greater diversity, representation, and inclusion. New Day is committed to, New Day films have been broadcast on PBS, HBO, and other media outlets. And we are celebrating our 50th year 50 years of surviving the dynamic distribution landscape, and our stories are provocative and really bring a lot of diversity and discussion to the room. And our filmmakers have won Academy Awards, including our founder Julia Reichardt, and several. They've been played in fantastic film festivals, and most recently, Davenport won the documentary directing award at Sundance for his film I Didn't See You There. And so I'm going to let Larissa take over from here, and we're looking forward to a very, very dynamic conversation with our panelists.
Thank you so much. And I just want to also point out that last year's 2021 Sundance also featured one of our filmmakers today, Debbie Lum, and her film Try Harder. And so we've got quite a few alum that have been part of that, as well as many incredible film festivals. All right, without further ado, let me introduce you to our first panelist, and I want to introduce Deanne Borcher Lim. She's the producer, director, and writer of First Person Plural, In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, Memory of a Forgotten War, and Geographies of Kinship, which we are spotlighting today. She also served as the executive producer for AKA Dawn Bonus, which won an Emmy Award, as well as Kelly Loves Tony, On Coal River, Ishi's Return and Breathing, the Eddie Zhang story. She has contributed as a consultant, story editor, and producer on numerous documentary projects. She's also the former director of the Center for Asian American Media, otherwise known as CAM, and Deanne is the recipient of the Women, Peace, and Security Fellowship from the San Francisco Film Society for film Crossings, about women peacemakers advocating for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Welcome, Deanne.
Hi, everybody.
And with Deanne, I'm going to also introduce Dr. Nicholas Hartlepp, who is the Robert Charles Billings Endowed Chair in Education at Berea College, where he chairs the Department of Education Studies. He would eventually go on to receive his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Before coming to Berea College, Dr. Hartlepp chaired the Department of Early Childhood and Elementary Education at the Metropolitan State University, and an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution. And while there, he also served as a graduate program coordinator. Dr. Hartlepp has published 25 books, the most recent being his second edition, Asian American Scholars of Education, 21st Century Pedagogies, Perspective and Experiences, with what was published by Peter Lang. And of course, he's got a lot more accolades. His book, Racial Battle, Fatigue, and Faculty, Perspectives and Lessons on Higher Education with Daisy Bell, was named an outstanding book by the Society Professors of Education. And most recently, Profiles in Diversity Journal named him an Asian leader worth watching, and I'm glad we're watching him today. And since we have Debbie here too, I'm going to give her a quick little introduction. She is the director of Try Harder, which was a New York Times Critics' Pick and premiered at the 2021 Sundance Film Festival. The film received many accolades, and Debbie was nominated for the Truer Than Fiction Independent Spirit Award, alongside a theatrical and wide release with community partners. And they've developed a campaign to promote student mental health and AAPI stories. Lum's previous feature documentary Seeking Asian Female premiered at South by Southwest Film Festival and was a fan favorite on PBS's Independent Lens. Lum's editing credits include AKA Dawn Bonus, which she worked with Deanne on. Kelly Loves Tony. So I know there's going to be some synergy here between Debbie and Deanne because they go way back. And she's currently developing a documentary called My Tiger Mom and producing My Uncle the Fugitive. Both sound very intriguing. A personal political tale about modern Taiwanese democracy with director Kathy Huang. So thank you for Debbie for being here. We're going to bring in your impact producer for Try Harder, Anna Yo, and a little bit later. But first, I wanted to show a trailer for Geographies of Kinship so that the audience can get to know a little bit about this subject of Korean transnational adoptees. In this powerful tale about the rise of Korea's global adoption program, 4 adult adoptees return to their country of birth and recover the personal histories that were lost when they were adopted. Let's show the trailer for Geographies of Kinship. All right, I think we've dropped the link in there. So we're running into some technical issues with the sharing of the trailer. But Deanne, if you could just briefly share a little bit more about the film and why you decided to make it.
Sure. So Geographies of Kinship follows 4 Korean adopted adults who decide to return to Korea in search of the histories that were lost when they were adopted. And it includes 2 adoptees from the United States and an adoptee from Switzerland and Sweden, because Korean adoptees were about 200,000 Korean children were adopted overseas since the 1950s and adopted throughout North America, Europe, and Australia. And so it follows these 4 individuals, and interspersed with their personal stories is a broader history of Korean transnational adoption, starting with the Korean War and going through post-war industrialization and modernization in South Korea, and the expansion of adoption actually during a time of rising wealth in Korea through the 1980s and even today, actually. The film is available on PBS's World Channel. You can stream it now for free for the rest of June. So I hope you have a chance to check it out. And of course, it's available on New Day Films.
Yeah, and I just found it very insightful personally. I didn't know a lot about the history in Korea that led to this proliferation of adoption there. And so it gave me definitely a lot of new knowledge on that. Can you also just share a little bit about your own personal experience as an adoptee and how that's framed your perspective on AAPI identity?
Yeah, I was adopted myself at the age of 8 from South Korea by an American family and grew up in California. And when I arrived to the United States in 1966, everyone thought I was a war orphan, that my father had been killed during the Korean War and that my mother had died giving birth to me. And many years later, when I was in college, I learned that that was not true. I was not a war orphan. I was actually born after the Korean War armistice was signed and the fighting had ended. And in fact, I wasn't actually an orphan in the technical sense. I had a family in Korea and was eventually reunited with my birth mother, as well as my brother and sisters and a very large extended family. So that's kind of what led me to make, actually this Geographies of Kinship is my 3rd film about Korean adoption. I've made 2 prior films, the first called First Person Plural, which is about the search and reunion with my Korean family. And the second film is called In the Matter of Cha Jang-hee, which chronicles my efforts to search for the girl whose identity I came with to the US. I was actually adopted by my American family under another child's name, and her name was Cha Jang-hee. And I go back to Korea to look for the real girl whose identity that was switched with mine. So that's called In the Matter of Cha Jang-hee. And during the course of making those 2 films and traveling around the world, I just met so many Korean adoptees all over the world, and it really made me wonder and think more deeply about how we came to be all over the world and what our histories were, and what were the social, political, historical circumstances that led to so many children being sent overseas and adopted primarily by Western families. So that's what inspired me to make Geographies of Kinship.
Wow. We'll unpack a little bit more, about, I think, your sense of identity and everyone else's. But, if we're able to, I think we may have fixed our technical issue. If we can share the trailer to Geographies of Kinship so we can give a little bit of context. Here we go. Hooray. Here's a little sneak peek.
I had no name, only the date when I was abandoned. I didn't look like my mother, I didn't look like my father, I didn't look like my brothers. The other kids would always think that I was Chinese.
Our parents told us we were orphans, that we didn't have any parents.
I knew I was Korean, but I didn't know what that meant.
The Korean War left thousands of children orphaned. The image in Western countries was that there's a continuous supply of Korean orphans.
If you're the illegitimate offspring of a Korean woman, you have no place. As far as the law was concerned, you didn't exist.
As the adoption rates from Korea hit their peak in the mid-'80s,
The majority of them were from single mothers.
My American parents were told they were getting orphans. But when I started to ask questions about my adoption, my mom just got up and she walked away.
자신을 떠나보낸 가족과 나라지만 해외 입양인들의 애타는 사연을 부영희 기자가 취재했습니다.
Many adoptees want to know what happened and how did it happen.
Yeah, Mommy, it's like looking in the mirror.
I feel very close with my family here, but I have this loss, and also I have this curiosity. I think it speaks volumes about us as humans, how we always want to go back.
It's a journey where I started to learn who am I.
Very, very powerful stories. I'm going to bring in Dr. Nicholas Hartlepp here. Nicholas, you're not only a professor of education, but you are also a Korean adoptee. And share a little bit about your experience and maybe some of your struggles with AAPI identity and how some of the things that Deanne shared, has resonated with you.
Yeah. Well, first off, when I was invited to the panel and I saw her name, I was like, wow, living legend. Very familiar with all of her films. So it's a great honor to share space with her and you, Debbie. Thinking of her films and my work on identity, adoption, being an adopted Asian American, a Korean adoptee is the single most challenging thing in my whole life. There's a book called Parenting as an Adoptee, and I have 3 daughters. My wife is white, so I have biracial children. And when being an adopted person is part of your identity, it makes you, it surfaces a lot of things, your health, your genetics, how tall will my children be, will they be healthy? And so part of my story was I found my biological father in Korea, and so I have a relationship with him. I don't know my biological mother. And so I searched when I was doing my PhD, and it was because another Korean adoptee really inspired me. John Palmer, read his book, Dance of Identities, changed my life forever, empowered me to say, I need to own my story. So many times people tell you what your story is, and until you know exactly what it is, you really won't be whole. So for once, I was whole when I found out my true story. And the story was my father was having hard times, was alcoholic, living on the street. He connected with a woman who was married at the time and got pregnant, and then she had me, and the story kind of ended that they broke apart and relinquished me. And I think God, I'm a Christian, and I think God always has his hand on me because my father now is a pastor, despite spending time in prison. And everything he did was actually in my benefit. So he put me up for international adoption, thinking it would be harder for me to find him. Holt helped find me. And so even when because I was born in Seoul, in my name, my unique name, Kolmoil, my Korean name. So I just think it's really crazy, you know, and there's so many people here that are in this space listening, watching these films that are touched by, I mean, even Debbie's film. Oh my God, I got a freshman in high school, and the pressure that she's under, I could just relate. And so watching Debbie's film was perfect for me as well, you know. But being Asian American right now, there's no time that's harder, especially COVID. I mean, all of the racism about the China virus, there's xenophobia, and people don't care if you're Korean. To them, you're Chinese, you're Asian, you're East Asian. They don't care. You're a tiger mom, you're a tiger dad, you know. So and I study that. I have the privilege of studying that professionally. So I do a lot of writing and research on the mono minority stereotype of Asians.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing your insights. And, you know, why do you think it is important for educators to have a better understanding of the, you know, not just the Asian American experience, but even the Asian adoptee experience? Nicholas, you can answer first, and Deanne, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, as the only male, I don't want to talk too much. I've done some research on mostly with Asian American transracial adoptee collegians, so college students, and you know, it's important to know about this topic and understand this because of microaggressions, also feelings of stereotype threat. So Asian Americans, not all Asian Americans are good at math, and are even do excel academically. So when we pigeonhole students, whether they're K-12 or post-secondary college students, it really limits them, and what allows them, you know, doesn't allow them to be full humans. So the fact that we have filmmakers in this space, I really respect filmmakers, because film is just like books. You do the research, you have to have the artistry, you know, and so you know, music makers, filmmakers, authors, we're all creative people. And it's vital that we share these stories that are not stereotypical stories. And that's what's fantastic about this work.
Great. I wholeheartedly agree with the importance of that. Deanne, anything you wanted to add on? Unmute. And then I'll bring Debbie and Anna in.
Your question was why it's important to for educators to understand about Asian adoptees or Korean adoptees.
Yes.
You know, I think that when you look back at Asian American history and identity, questions of identity, Korean adoption actually plays a central role in Asian American history and Asian immigration history. Prior to 1965, when immigration laws were liberalized and many more Asians came to the United States, the few Asians that were allowed were Korean adoptees during the 1950s who were adopted by American parents, as well as Korean military brides, women who were marrying American servicemen who were stationed in Korea during and after the Korean War. And these two populations, who in many ways were ostracized or, you know, not wanted by the Korean government and South Korea, were allowed to come to the United States and became part of the later, you know, burgeoning Korean American and Asian American community. And so I think that's an important part of our history as a collective Asian community here in the United States. Also, you know, the origins of Korean transnational adoption it is really rooted in Korea's division in 1945 and the subsequent Korean War, which was fought between 1950 and 53. And that war, was just devastating. It led to about 4 million deaths, 1 million Chinese and 3 million Koreans, the majority of the Koreans who died being civilians. And that was a conflict that led to the eventual adoption of mixed race children initially, mascots and houseboys by the military initially, and then the mixed race children, and then eventually the 200,000 children that came later. And the Korean War is not just a war that was fought there, but it was a war that the US was engaged in a very significant way. The US was involved in Korea's division and was the primary protagonist in the war. And so to the extent that that history is part of our collective history as American society, I think is an important aspect of what, we as educators and the community, I think is important for us to know.
Yeah, and I think I appreciated that one element in your film. I mean, there's many elements, but certainly how you weaved the historical timeline with the adoption story, because that really gave me a clear sense, as I never really, you don't really learn about this history in school. And so I thank you for laying that even in the summary that you gave, but you do that so beautifully in the film. I'm going to bring in Debbie Lum and Anna Yo, and we're going to show the trailer for Try Harder. I introduced Debbie earlier, but I'm going to bring in Anna Yo as well, the impact producer for Try Harder. She's a Chinese Indonesian American filmmaker and self-taught animator from northeastern Massachusetts. She's a designer and impact producer on Try Harder and strongly relates to the film as a class of 2017 high school grad herself. And she received her bachelor's in film studies and economics from Wesleyan University and is currently based in Brooklyn and Boston. For those who are not familiar with Try Harder follows students at San Francisco's iconic public school, Lowell High School, as they experience the high-stakes American college application process. It made its broadcast premiere this month on PBS's Independent Lens. Let's share the trailer for Try Harder.
I would love to go to UC Berkeley,
Harvard, Stanford,
Columbia.
The kids who come here, they are competing in a world that is very high achieving. It's terrifying.
Look away from Stanford, you're not getting in. Let's try this.
College admissions, it's like, the only sure thing is that there's no sure things.
Oh my God!
So Debbie, as I always have this question, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times. Why Lowell High School, and what did you learn through these students, especially about API identity as you observed them?
Hi, everyone. Good question. I'm based in San Francisco, but I am not from San Francisco. As for many people, Lowell High School in San Francisco is an iconic school. It's the oldest public high school west of the Mississippi. And, if you read the news, it's always in the news these days alongside Stuyvesant and Boston Latin and a lot of selective admission public high schools that where, very relevant to this conversation, it's a majority AAPI student body. And that's actually one of the things that really drew me to this story about Lowell High School, which is I was so curious what that would be like, what it would be like for a young student who is Asian American to grow up in a place where being Asian American is the norm, or being Asian American is normal. It's kind of what I joke, because it's actually not in so many other places. I grew up myself in the Midwest in St. Louis, Missouri, and I have to say, outside of Deanne Borcher once being my boss and inspiration as the head of Center for Asian American Media and advocating for so many things for our community in terms of the arts and the media. I have to say, what Nicholas is saying about transracial adoption, it's something that, I often feel like I can identify with, not in terms of a personal history, but being Asian American and being in a sort of transracial existence, and where everyone around you is of a different race. And so I'm actually really interested in stories about our community that really speak to our larger society. And if you look at, Asian American, the so-called model minority student, all of these kids that we profiled, we followed 5 kids. 3 of them were Asian American. 1 was a white boy, and the 5th was a biracial African American and white girl. So it was a diverse group. But the Asian American student in that sort of paradigm of the high achieving student is really, creating identity for everybody in this country. But we don't really look at it through that lens. We sort of we're kind of, off on the sidelines. So it was really important for me to center that story.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that was really interesting to me was also how kind of the parents played a role in, you got to interview some of the parents and how their role kind of helped shape some of the way their kids were thinking or prioritizing things. We'll kind of broaden this conversation a little bit, but I do want to speak with Anna here. She is the impact producer for Try Harder, but more importantly, I want to hear from her a little bit about her experience, because you've got some intersecting identities here as a Chinese Indonesian American. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and how you kind of see this broader conversation about AAPI identity and how we define it?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Larissa, for having me. And thank you, everyone, for having me here, too, because as I mentioned in my bio, I really just graduated, and I'm definitely not the only impact producer on this team. There's also Rennie Soga and Ang Kyung Ho. But it's great to be able to talk to you all just as educators. And yeah, I'm Chinese Indonesian, and I grew up in Ann Arbor, Massachusetts, as which is a town that is predominantly white, with families who have lived there for a long time. And so my friends in high school were largely the other Asian students, and because of that, we largely tended to gravitate towards one another by virtue of being Asian in a predominantly white school. But for me, there was still a bit of a disconnect because while most of my friends are Chinese, and I'm mostly ethnically Chinese, my culture is more Indonesian, and my parents speak Indonesian, and we really have no ties to China. And on top of that, I'm just an American kid. And so I think that having this hard to pinpoint identity in a way also means that when I was applying to college, that experience, so much of it is selling yourself, being able to know who you are. And it puts a lot of pressure on and when you're young, trying to figure out what your AAPI identity is. And it kind of can almost feel like something more to commodify than celebrate. So this was a really important film to me, clearly. And I think it's a great encapsulation of kind of what students are feeling this time, and also just a great conversation point to talk about AAPI identity and how to encourage it in students today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And to kind of, go back to a point that Nicholas was making a little bit earlier about, the diversity, not everybody is good at math that's Asian. I happen to be, but not everybody is. Let's expand on this. Why is it important for us to make sure that the diverse range in the AAPI experiences and heritage are reflected? Especially, we have a lot of librarians and teachers that are, here with us today. As people, educating the community and educating classrooms, why is it important for us to reflect that and to teach about that and to know about that? Nicholas, you want to chime in first, since this is your area of study?
Yeah. So as a model minority, we're placed as a wedge between whiteness and blackness, and whiteness is revered and blackness is detested. So we're, as model minorities, that's not a term of endearment that we should embrace. That's actually a form of racist love. And so honorary white status doesn't do anyone well. And, I'm just reflecting, as I mentioned, I have a freshman in high school, and she put so much pressure on herself because she wants to go to these elite schools. But the history of some of these elite schools, Stanford, for instance, the governor Leland Stanford was one of the most xenophobic persons, hated Asian people. And so the closer that we draw to what's populist and has high status is actually the very same spaces that detest our presence. So I think it's important to tell these counter stories. Someone mentioned, like Deanne said, it's not taught in history. It's not taught in schools. Schools need to have better curriculum. The teachers themselves need to learn this. You can't teach something you don't know. And that's why film is good. That's why books, I've written books about curriculum on Asian Americans. That's why these centers on media, Asian American media, are important. So all these sectors have to come together. Recently wrote a piece on South Asian American spelling bees. So the Scripps National Spelling Bee, the mascot is like, really the face of it is a South Asian brown skinned boy or girl, and not all parents, push spelling. Another component I think is vital is we have a class analysis to this, because, if you're Asian American, transracial, class is always at play. How much money you have, what your parents do for an employment, the spaces that you're raised. Debbie said she was a Midwesterner. I grew up in the Midwest, Green Bay, Wisconsin. One of the racist places that I've ever known. I've ran away from that place. I'll never go back. I just don't want to be there. So thinking about the reality and transracial adoptees, one thing it's really hard is you can't confide with your parents, because when you say, hey, mom, dad, I'm experiencing that, they say, oh, they're just being kids, just ignore them, and they diminish that reality. They invalidate your story. I was with my children going into a YMCA, and a middle school, 3 middle school white boys were saying ching chong to me. And my daughters heard that. They're like, Dad, why are they doing that? I turned around, I confronted them. I said, what would your parents say about you doing these racist things? And they started getting red. They knew that they had done something wrong. And then I walked away, and I try to model that for my kids. But, I tried to think about what they would say, and they probably would support their kid, because that's learned behavior. So I think the education is a time where we can shift people's perceptions, their biases, their prejudices, and all of these are learning. I think all of us are educators in this space. We just do it differently, and we're students. We're always learning more. So, so thinking about Anna, she's already accomplished so much as a young Asian American. Like, this is good. Like, she's got so much more in front of her that she can help shift society. And so that's my thoughts.
No, those are all good thoughts, and also in packing some of the misconceptions, I think about our community. Deanne, Debbie, or Anna, you want to jump in and add anything to some of the misconceptions that you see, and why it's important to acknowledge the range?
I'll jump in there talking about high school students and the model minority myth. So, at Lowell High School, which, is considered to be the top ranked school, all the so-called smart kids, so many of them are Asian American. There's the stereotype that these kids are academic robots, that they are just kind of competitive machines. And in a lot of ways, the kind of background noise that people don't want to say out loud is that they're the competition. They're making life difficult for all of us, everyone else who's not Asian, who's somehow more. It's almost as if these kids are, they're dehumanized, and that is has a lot to do with the mono-minority stereotype. And if you look, there's a lot of data on that. Asian Americans as a whole don't get a lot of resources. They don't get mentorship. They don't get, you know, the support because of this idea that they don't need help, that they're kind of perfect as a group monolithically. And you know, you see all these bright students, and that's why. But the truth is that, you know, even the kids who are, you know, like the kids that we profiled at Lowell High School, who are, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, they're gonna be fine, and they're gonna, you know, do really well. They're having serious mental health repercussions. There's all these studies that show that kids who are high achieving, you know, the sort of quintessential AAPI student profile is have 3 times the amount of anxiety as the average teenager. They've been named at risk for mental health consequences alongside kids who are living in poverty, kids who are in foster care or having you know, abusive situations. So actually, it is a problem that it's a sort of invisible problem that that we really need to examine.
Yeah, I mean, this is also Mental Health Awareness Month. So, you know, I think that's the toll that a lot of people don't realize that happens when there isn't a healthy sense of AAPI identity. You know, and speaking of that, like, what do you think we can do as a community, as parents, as educators, to help children and students develop a better sense of healthy AAPI identity?
I can jump in. I mean, I think that I've always been someone who's really interested in film and in Asian American stories and Asian American issues. And I think by virtue of me even being here and having worked with Debbie and even being on this panel, which is very, I feel very grateful about, is a testament to the fact that I've had really good mentorship and people who have worked on this film and who also have been working in Asian American media for so long, kind of carving out a path for me to see what it looks like to pursue this line of work and to pursue Asian American issues with gusto and with a lot of grit and with a lot of love. And so I think that when we talk about cultivating healthy Asian American identity in young people and in students, I think just kind of extending that hand and you know, sharing your experiences with those people and then showing them too that, like, you know, what's possible and what's out there. And yeah, just reaching out and just giving them a space to be able to talk about their identity and then yours and then together.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that I'm not sure for so much from the AAPI identity perspective, but maybe from the adoptee perspective that, you know, I think, well, first, I think that the whole model minority idea was part of the adoption of Korean children, in the sense that there was this idea that Asian children or Korean children at the time would be, you know, easily assimilable, that they would be racially flexible, that they could fit in and not rock the boat and not create problems and be smart and all of those things. And those ideas did contribute to the popularity of Korean children among primarily white parents who are adopting Korean children. I think that some of those expectations, you know, then were conveyed to the children themselves. I think in terms of adoption and mental health, I think a lot about how the idea of the full severance adoption, where a child is completely severed from their first families, and that all adoption records, and including the original birth certificate, are essentially sealed, has had a direct mental health impact on adopted people. And also on birth parents as well as adoptive parents. And I think that came out of this kind of single parent or single mother paradigm, where unwed mothers and single mothers weren't allowed to keep their children and were forced to relinquish them. And so I think that with Asian adoptees or with Korean adoptees, and I think of that myself, you know, adopted into a white family where my history as a Korean person and my Korean identity and past were completely absent, and was completely erased really from my existence. And I was really encouraged to only embrace my white American family and my quote white identity and aspire to be white. And so I think that created a lot of complicated mental health issues for me and my fellow cohorts, who were in similar situations. And I think that denying my Asian identity and denying my Korean history did not enable me to fully be my full self in my adoptive family or in American society. And so to the extent that we can embrace that history and know more about the circumstances that led to adoptions, both on the part of adoptive parents as well as on our birth family side, the healthier I think we could be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know personally, when I was growing up, I wanted to be blonde hair and blue eyes because that was the model of popularity at my school. And that was what I saw on TV. Anybody that was Caucasian was perceived to be beautiful. And for me, it took me years. And I think it's only within like the recent decade that I've really come to accept my personal, pride in my heritage, but also my Americanness that can coexist, at the same time. We're going to get to some questions from the audience, but before we do that, I wanted to make a few quick announcements. But if you do have questions, I'm seeing some questions come in the chat. Please start entering your questions in the chat if you have them for our panelists. But I do want to make a few announcements. For those of you who would like to follow us on social media, and I think we have a slide to share, you can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook at New Day Films. And you can also follow us on Instagram at New Day Doc Films. And I'm dropping those in the link. Also wanted to share with you that New Day Films, here we go, with our slides here. New Day Films offers a variety of ways to stream our diverse collection of films. Geographies of Kinship and Try Harder, as well as my film, Far East Deep South, are among that collection, including ones dealing with many other films dealing with the Asian American Pacific Islander experience. In fact, we do have a film that's new to our collection called Not Your Model Minority by John Osaki, who's actually going to be featured next month with another film that he's doing. And we offer live-to-file licenses for most film, and also we have DVD purchases. And I know we have some librarians on this call, and just to let you know, New Day is actually running a special for the month of May, and you can get 50% off DVDs for this month with the code NEWDAY50, and we'll drop that in the chat so that you can take advantage. And we'll also be emailing out the list of resources that I know a lot of you are sharing in the chat. Some of people will be mentioning certain links throughout this conversation. We will be sharing some of those links with you in a follow-up email after this conversation today. We also have a upcoming filmmakers webinar that we do every month. If you are a filmmaker, and I saw a few in the chat that are filmmakers and are maybe interested in joining New Day Films or even adding your film to our collection, our next orientation webinar is next month. It's June 8th at 3 p.m. And we will share a link and in the chat with that webinar, as well as in a follow-up email to you to be able to join that. And going back to, let's see, our next slide is, yes, announcing that Reframe and Refresh, save the date, June 29th, same time, Wednesday, 2 p.m. We're going to be talking with Leanne Dance, who directed the film My Dear Children, which follows a woman's quest to unravel a family mystery and journey that reveals a little-known anti-Jewish tragedy following World War I. And John Osaki, who both directed Not a Model Minority, but also Reparations, which seeks to raise awareness of the Black reparations struggle and how that story is told through the Black and Asian Americans who believe in collective liberation can be achieved by standing with one another. So that should be another fascinating conversation. Of course, please do visit New Day. And I think we had one slide about the films, just a reminder that Geographies of Kinship and Try Harder are currently available to stream for free this month on PBS. So take advantage of that if you want to get a preview of that film, so you can see if you want to use that in classrooms or bring it into your library. It's a great opportunity to see that. Okay, now let's get to some questions, because I know you have lots of questions. Let's see here. First question here is, this one is for Debbie. Do you have any suggested reading for Asian American parents looking to better understand and break the cycle of academic pressure and mental health issues? And I would extend that. I'm sure Nicholas might have some recommendations too.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, you know, we're kind of, all of us as parents, I've got 2 kids. You're in the trenches and the pressure is so intense, and it's really intense for Asian American kids. You know, Nicholas, maybe I'm going to lean on you for, I mean, I find that there's great books out there on specifically college admission, but they're not necessarily written from an Asian American perspective, which is why I made this film. And I know some titles that I actually haven't read, but I've heard they're really good. So I could, maybe Nicholas might.
There's a book, I know the publisher, it's by a white woman though, it's Jossie Bass published it. And like Debbie said, it's tailored more towards those rising junior and senior high schoolers and the pressure that they're putting themselves under. But the truth of the matter, you know, Amy Chua, her book didn't help, and that's the problem. She received so much media attention, and then her and her husband, they write the second book. And there is a book that I've just started reading. It's really fascinating. It's called The Hybrid Tiger, and it kind of unpacks it from Asian perspective, but pushes back against the tiger parenting, like saying, like, no, so Amy Chua is saying, like, oh, you play your violin out in the, you know, all these like horrific, really intense parenting strategies, where this author is saying, well, that's not what tigers do. Tigers are very loving. They love, and they're patient, and, you know, they lick their cub and stuff. So trying to really push back against a stereotypical way of parenting. And I think that transcends all culture. I think if you're fairly, you know, stable, I think you want to see your children successful. I mean, that it doesn't matter if you're white, black, Asian, you know, international, domestic. It's just the problem comes when we're pigeonholed and said, like, this is how you parent. So I mentioned I'm adopted. Well, I have my adoptive parents are white, and they divorced and they remarried. My stepmother is Chinese. And so I have a very blended, mixed, adopted, very heterogeneous family. But my stepmother, Tenyan, she is not a tiger mom, but her kids do well in school, you know? And so, like, is that attributable to Tenyan? No, it's attributable that she has a PhD in chemistry, you know, and has money. So it's a class thing, right? So I would say the fact that she has money is a higher predictor of success for my brother and sister than her being Chinese. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So it's correlation isn't causation, but we do need to see some of these correlates to success, and also understand that parents with money parent perhaps differently than parents that don't have access to these and knowledge of it.
Yeah, all really good points. And I'll try to share those books that you mentioned, Nicholas, with the, you know, follow-up email. We have another question here. And I'm curious how folks approach incorporating intersectional Black and Brown solidarity in your work and conversations, even like these. I think about how not only Asian Americans are seen as competition, but the idea that all BIPOC communities are competing for one spot, and we're asked to compete to achieve or to be accepted within whiteness. How do you all suggest that we work together to combat the scarcity mindset created created and enforced by white supremacy. And I know, Deanne, you had somebody that was biracial in your film, you know, and then Debbie, you also spotlighted somebody that was also biracial, Black and white. Either one of you want to start addressing this question?
Well, within the history of Korean transnational adoption, the first children that were adopted were actually mixed race children, as I said before. And the first American citizens to adopt Korean children, Black Korean children, were African-American soldiers who were stationed in Korea during and after the Korean War. And it's a fascinating history that people actually don't know a lot about. And I think, it's a complex history that includes war, militarism, a lot of exploitation, but a lot of romantic relationships between American servicemen and Korean women. I think that looking at those stories really help trace kind of the intimate connections between our various communities. That is very instructive for us as we look for increasing, interconnections and solidarities. And there's actually, I'm working on a new project that will look a little more closely at Afro-Asian solidarity and the history of, Afro-Asian solidarity going back to pre-World War II. So I think that looking at the past and these relationships can really inform our current present day concerns.
Debbie, you wanted to jump in to say something?
Yeah, when you look at education and Asian Americans, AAPI students and African American students, I really think that the media has created this sort of false culture war. And I say that based on experience, reliving high school with several classes of high school students, because the kids that we talked to, they were very aware that, if you check the box for being Asian, it meant that you had maybe a lower chance of getting into college. And, there's all this talk about affirmative action and Black and brown students, and are they competing against them for the spots? And the kids that we talked to did not believe that at all. I mean, they could see the bigger picture and see that, there's a problem with this sort of a structure of systemic racism where, different groups are sort of, pitted against each other. And I really feel like it's a way of maybe some cultural misunderstanding from, the immigrant parents, and just generational difference. And that for the most part, as Nicholas was referencing, Asian Americans really support affirmative action. And, it's this idea if you're local, or you're following Lowell High School in the news, there's a lot talked about this sort of racist problem that they have. And there's this kind of implication that because it's an Asian American school, that maybe somehow it's more racist against African American students, which is really not the issue. It's an issue that we have in society, that we are racist against African Americans, and that the degree that it happens at this all Asian American school is the way that it happens at every school in the public school district, in the school districts. And it's like in our film, for anyone who does watch it, one of the characters, Rachel, who is African American, she talks about these attitudes, and people really assume that they came from Asian American students, and that's just the way that we think about it, when actually they weren't. It wasn't really that you kind of have to see the film to understand it. But what I'm saying, but there really is a misconception that we're at war with each other, when actually there's so much solidarity. That's where the whole idea of AAPI studies came out of, the civil rights movement. So
Yeah, no, those were great questions and, great answers. I mean, I personally, having in my film the story of the African American and the Chinese in the South during segregation, living very, symbiotically, that another part of history that a lot of people don't know about. It goes to show that the more we know about the histories, especially where our communities intersect and where we have solidarity, will go a long way to helping frame, where we are today and hopefully moving in the future where people see those examples. Because often, like you said, the media or other things have pitted the communities against one another. We are running up against the hour. Last couple words I want, in case you didn't get something to get in, I'm just going to go lightning round around everybody. Last words before we say goodbye. We want to thank everybody for joining us. But Nicholas, last word?
I'm just gonna say I'm gonna watch these films that these filmmakers are making. These all sound amazing, and yeah, and I'd encourage all the audience to read, to watch, to share. The biggest thing you can do is read Asian American authors, support, buy their work, purchase the DVDs and the streaming access, and encourage your libraries to buy the books. That's the biggest thing you can do.
Yeah, thanks. Anna, last word?
Mostly just thank you. And I'm grateful that we could have this conversation about, AAPI heritage. And I think that even having these conversations means that, every Asian person you see might have an unexpected background, and that just encourages us all to approach identity in a way where we ask more respectful questions and make fewer assumptions. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Larissa.
Debbie, last word, and then Deanne.
Thank you so much for being here. And every Asian American, we all have stories to tell, and we also love to connect with all of you. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. But thank you so much.
Yeah, and we can definitely reach out to our filmmakers here at newday.com. And if for some reason you want to reach out to Dr. Nicholas Hartlepp, you can find him at Berea College, or, feel free to shoot an email to me and I will forward his message on to you. And Deanne, you get the last word. Well, I guess I get the last word to say goodbye, but before I have the last word, you get the last word.
I just want to say thank you, Larissa. This has been great. I'm also a proud member owner of New Day Films, and I think it's a wonderful resource for educators. So I hope you check out our library. And there's also a wonderful, growing, vibrant community of Korean adoptee scholars in the adoption studies area. So I would encourage you to look at authors like Kim Park Nelson, Kim McKee, Sujin Pate, and many others to learn more about the impact of Korean adoption and AAPI identity.
Thank you so much. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again on June 29th for our next Reframe and Refresh panel. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye, everyone.